With Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online. I'm sure you are sympathetic, Brendan, to kids or parents who are struggling to feed kids. What's wrong primarily? I've probably answered many of the questions in my intro, but what is wrong primarily with the government stepping in a little more, given how much the government have stepped in quite a lot of late?
I think I think the campaigners for this and the politicians arguing for this, for school meals to be provided over holidays, they underestimate the problems of dragging more and more people into such a dependent relationship on the state. That has a really negative impact on people's lives. I fully support free school meals in schools in term time. If kids can't afford to get a good lunch, the school should provide them with one. It helps them to learn, it helps them to concentrate, and it keeps them healthy. That's great. But if you create a situation where the state is expected to feed children, that has a really detrimental impact on families and on their sense of independence and on their sense of initiative. And too much welfare can have a really degrading impact on communities and families.
What is the evidence, though, that this would create state dependency?
I think we still have, we already have state dependency in many ways, and the welfareism as almost like a political ideology has grown exponentially in recent years. More and more sections of society are now dependent on the state for different areas of their lives, for paying their housing bill, for topping up their wages in some situations, for providing other sorts of benefits. And I think that's a dangerous process. I think it really lessens people's sense of being autonomous individuals in autonomous communities who look out for each other. It alienates people from each other by making them increasingly reliant on the faceless bureaucrats of the state to provide them with everything they need. People underestimate how destructive that is. But the other side of this discussion, which I think is fascinating, I was just listening to your clip of Richard Bergen. There is so much extraordinary hypocrisy coming from these Labour politicians, because lots of these Labour politicians and Labour activists were at the forefront of demanding the lockdown. They're now demanding a second national lockdown, which will propel more people into joblessness and poverty and despair. And yet they think they can get a few brownie points by saying, give kids a meal every now and then. It's like they want to plunge people into poverty while throwing a few scraps of food from the table. It's really hypocritical and out of order.
And in terms of the kind of mischief behind this, but one of the many aspects of this, and I agree with what you just said in terms of, impoverishing people through lockdown seems extraordinary. Then to try and play the sort of, we care about poor people card, it is extraordinary. But there's also this business, as I mentioned just before you came on, that any Labour MP could just pull any kind of question out the bag at any time they fancy, and then just stand back and watch the government have to oppose it, and then they have the open goal to put the boot in, like dear old Mr. Bergen.
What these people are doing, they're turning politics into a moral pantomime. I don't even think the term virtue signalling covers this anymore, even though they're no doubt doing a lot of that. This is a moral pantomime where they set up the Tories as these evil scumbags, these kind of Dickensian figures who want to starve children to death. And then they set up the Labour Party as these wonderful, virtuous beings who want to save the poor kids from themselves. It's a pantomime, and it's completely unreal. It has no substance in reality. And of course, anyone who criticises them, as you've been saying, is instantly denounced as a monster. Anyone who says things are a bit more complicated, or actually what people need are jobs and good wages and less lockdowns, anyone who says that is denounced as a monster. I come from a working class background. I went to a school which was in a fairly deprived part of London. I know about the huge problems people face, but it won't be helped by these kind of posturing, preening Labour politicians who want to marshal poor people effectively as a weapon to use against the Tories. That's really cynical.
The question we're throwing out is, whose responsibility is it to feed your kids, you or the government? What's your answer to that?
I think it's fundamentally the responsibility of parents, and I say that as someone who recognises completely that some parents struggle to make ends meet. And I think any kind of charitable arrangement or any kind of local initiative that assists those parents with food and other issues is absolutely wonderful. In fact, we could do with more of that. But I think the danger of inviting the state in to feed kids and to look after every aspect of people's lives is that it grates against those kinds of local initiatives and people helping each other. We've got to be wary about asking the state to fix every problem.
Brendan, thank you. Brendan O'Neill, of course, who is the editor of Spiked Online. And I get all of that. And it's interesting that Linda makes this point in terms of starving kids. Show me these starving kids, especially after the up-and-coming rollout from Apple of their new phone in November. Then we'll talk deprivation. I was talking to somebody in my family who's a primary school teacher, and she was my sister-in-law, and she was saying, you know, there are kids who come to school who haven't really had a meal. And there are kids who come to school who haven't had a wash. But they haven't had a meal because the parents couldn't afford it. They haven't had a meal because the parents are bloody awful and just not very good at being parents. Now, that's a whole different argument, isn't it, as to whether you can afford it, as distinct from whether you are parentally, you are of sound mind and judgment and know how it works. I mean, there are stories of kids who go to school. Yeah, kids who go to school never used a knife and fork. Because the parents say, well, isn't that what the school does? No, it's the school. You're the parent. This is a school. And of course, inevitably and understandably, that schools do get involved in social issues. Of course they do. That's part and parcel of what they do. And thank goodness when they are there to spot things that other people don't. We are glad of that. And we know that teachers will often, pass food over to kids who are hungry. I don't think that's always come around because the parents can't afford to feed their kids. So the Conservative position is clear. Look, we've already got a welfare system. We already pay for school meals. We've already brought in more free meals for, I think, the under sevens that wasn't there in quite the same way before, more free meals in that respect. And every party will say that their policy is more generous than the opposition party or any party's opposite. I understand that. But whose responsibility is it to feed your kids, you or the government? And we're widening that out about the welfare system as well, in terms of what you think, in terms of that relationship individuals have with it. And there are points when you call upon it. That's, when I grew up, that was, I think, the first time I ever signed on. I was probably about 18. It was only for about 3-4 weeks or something. And then again, when I was 19, I think there was a period then. It was quite simple back then. Because I did it once in Kent and once when I lived in Blackpool, of all places. And you literally just sort of went down there and signed a few papers, and then a couple of days later a cheque turned up. And you draw on it when you need to. You are short, so you need to use the system. Thank God we have a welfare system. Thank God we have an incredibly generous welfare system. Could it be more generous? Well, anything could be more generous. You could argue that it's a non-argument. You could keep saying that. And as Brendan rightly said, those who form any kind of argument against these very worthy causes are written off as some kind of, well, he said, a Dickensian pantomime monster. And he's bang on. And you heard Richard Bergen in that clip almost losing his sugar over this.